getting advice adds value.
Mm-hmm.
Women getting advice adds value. We know that women are great in making financial decisions,
Mm-hmm.
despite that messaging that often comes from society. But given that the industry has traditionally been dominated by men, is still dominated by men, and we're not just talking about advisors, we're talking about in policy, in government and in policy, in product design and product development. And superannuation is a perfect example of a product that is designed for a typical man starting work, continuing to work without a break, hitting their peak earnings in their 40s and 50s, and then retiring. And that's why we have men retiring with larger balances in this superannuation and more men having accounts than women. So there is this inherent bias in the industry. How have you seen that played out from an advice perspective? And what changes would you like to see in the industry to make the quality of advice provided to women better?
So I would love to see, there are a million things I'd love to see to improve the quality of advice for women. Number one, I think it's happened. The tax deductibility of advice, that's great. Should always be, have been a thing. For the changes that I'd like to see is less red tape. Last year and the year before, there were scholarships out there for women by Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, which supported women to get education, to become financial advisors. And that allowed more women to progress in their careers, which then allowed more women, or supported rather, that supported more women to become financial advisors, which then increases that diversity of women, which increases that diversity within financial advice. Some of the changes that I would like to see improved, like when we think about policy, one of the biggest challenges are that whole, if you haven't experienced it, and you don't know about it, why would you bring it to the table? Nothing needs to change from your situation. If you're a man in his 50s, you might know nothing about, you might have either not had children or completely forgotten about the exhaustion of having children and forgotten how hard it is to have small children, then therefore not really having a choice to work or not work because childcare is expensive. Those sorts of things really hamper women's ability to work, as well as caring for the older generation. So some things I'd like to see on a broad scale to help women's economic empowerment is things like free childcare. That'd be amazing. I'd love to see more women in politics, because the more lived experience people have, the more people can bring things up and make changes. And I want to give you a really practical example. So recently, my boss at Fox and Hare, he put it out there on LinkedIn asking a question about menstrual leave and leave for miscarriage. He's a gay man in his 30s, obviously never had to think about this sort of thing before. And he acknowledged it. He said, I have no idea about this. And actually you commented on his LinkedIn post and he said, what about perimenopausal and menopausal women? And he said, you know what? I didn't even know that was a thing. I had literally no idea what perimenopause was, never heard it before in my life. Fair. He's a gay man in his 30s. How would that be in his radar? Unless maybe he's seen his mum go through it, but his mum and my mum, like at their generations, not a lot talked about it, whereas now, much more open. And so now that's on his radar. And the idea is that if people have never experienced something, they need to have people who have experienced things in their circle so that then they know to change something. And if we don't have enough representation of women and diverse folk, whether that's neurotypical, whether that's First Nations, whether that's people in the LGBTQ plus community, people who've come from disadvantaged backgrounds, we're not really going to get the changes that we need to improve the world more generally. But when we think about the quality of advice, like you say, advice was built by men for men. And we need a huge shift to be able to make sure that advice can actually be built by everyone for everyone. And there's been some policy changes, but I think we have a huge way to go.